If you're in an academic research career or a research career outside of academia, it can sometimes feel like a lot of the critical things you are meant to achieve in your job can be completely outside your control. And of course, to some extent, that's true. There are a lot of factors, the assessment of reviewers who review your grants or your job promotion applications. But at the same time, there are ways you can think about these sort of core activities that you do that will restore some sense of some level of control over the outcomes that are so critical in your career. And that's what today's Hacking Academia video is all about. The key concept I wanted to get into today is this concept of choosing your preferred rejection mechanism. So fundamentally, in a lot of careers like this, you will be putting in a lot of things that are either successful or are rejected. So these could be paper submissions, they could be grant applications, they could be applications for prestigious prizes, they could be applications for promotion in your current position or beyond your current position. And these all have an outcome that can be varied, but in very competitive fields or where you're really stretching, a lot of the time they will unfortunately end in rejection. Now hopefully that rejection is temporary, but one of the things I want to really get into in this video is how you can think about how you would like to be rejected in order to restore some sense of control over the outcomes in your career. I want to start with a simple analogy. I realize golf is a very bespoke niche sport that many people don't play, but hopefully most people have a vague familiarity with how golf works. So in golf, imagine you are in a situation where you are hitting a ball towards the green, where you are trying to sink your ball into the hole, and there is a big creek or lake just in front of the hole, a little bit closer to you than the flag and the hole. The situation there is one where you have some choice in terms of how you would like to fail in that situation. So one option is you can try and hit it just the right length and get it to land right where the hole is, maybe get a hole in one. The other situation is you can overcompensate and hit the ball much more strongly than you think you need to, so that the ball is very likely to end up far beyond the hole, which sounds suboptimal, but what you are doing is you are taking the most critical risk out of play, which is this body of water in front of the hole that you definitely don't want to go into. So this is a very simple example, a sporting analogy, so to speak, of how you can exert some level of control about your preferred rejection or preferred failure mechanism. And this concept applies equally well to a number of core activities in an academic or research career. I'm going to start with an example. I'm going to go through a few examples in this video that are quite common for many people in these types of careers. The first example I want to talk about is the concept of submitting a proposal or a grant or fellowship application for some cool research that you want to do. And the key dimension we're going to talk about is whether what you're proposing to do is very closely aligned to what you've already been doing in your research career to date, or whether it is substantially stretching beyond what you've already done to go into relatively new areas of research, or perhaps totally, completely new areas of research. This is one of the key dimensions you might consider when you are drafting and creating an application for funding or a grant or fellowship proposal. Now, how does picking your preferred rejection mechanism factor into this? Well, one of the ways you can think about this is if the scheme you are applying for is very sensitive to whether you have enough expertise and enough experience in this area to really be feasible to pull off what you're proposing, you might deliberately err on the side of overemphasizing how close this is, or how close what you're proposing is to all the work that you've done previously in this field. You are trying to overwhelm or really get across the point that you are an expert, you are uniquely, feasibly capable to do this work, and you're doing that at the slight risk of someone coming back to you and saying, well, you're basically asking for funding to do what you've already done. So this is a sort of double-edged sword. You're taking a risk deliberately in one way because you don't want to run the risk that people or reviewers think that you're not sufficiently qualified. You'd rather run that risk deliberately of having someone come back and say, oh, this is too similar to what you are already doing. If it's a different grant scheme where the grant scheme parameters are specifically asking you to submit work that doesn't or replicate what you've already done, for example, there are some grant schemes that support academics or researchers to move or grow into new fields, you might deliberately decide to err too far on the other side. So really make the proposal completely novel work that's very clearly distinguished and completely separate from anything you've done. Again, you're running the opposite risk here of someone saying, well, you're not feasible for this, you don't have enough experience. But again, you're choosing to deliberately go really far one way or the other in order to exert some level of control over the outcome, and in particular, if you are rejected or are unsuccessful, why you are rejected or unsuccessful. Sticking with the theme of grants, a second example of where you might apply this principle of choosing your preferred rejection mechanism is in terms of how incremental versus blue sky crazy your proposal is for a grant or a fellowship. Again, this will come down to the nature of the scheme. So in a lot of what we'd call risk-averse schemes, the funding bodies and the reviewers are instructed essentially to make sure that it's very feasible and there's a very high likelihood that you will be able to successfully complete most, if not all, of the things you're proposing. So in that sort of situation, you might deliberately decide to propose something that is even more incremental than you might otherwise propose, so that you are making sure that no one is going to come back to you and say, this is too much of a fishing trip, this is too crazy, we don't think we can fund it. Again, you are deliberately running the risk or choosing to run the risk of someone saying that this is not a sufficiently large step forward, but you have some level of control over how you might get rejected if you are unsuccessful at the first try. In other types of schemes, they are really specifically looking for blue sky crazy research. This is research that cannot be funded through these risk-averse schemes. And so in this situation, you might again deliberately decide to go a little bit crazier and a little bit more sort of far out with your proposal. Again, you are choosing to deliberately run the risk of having someone say that's just too crazy, but you have some level of control over the likely rejection modality. So if you are unfortunately rejected, you're not going to be rejected because you weren't out there enough. You might get rejected because you're too crazy, but at least you're exerting some level of control over the outcome. A third example, again from the example of applying for grants or proposals, is the scope. And this is the old adage of trying to work out between a very narrow, very focused proposal and something that's very ambitious and very grand. And again, you have some choice and some control over how your proposal is going to be received, and if it is rejected, the likely rejection mechanism. So again, if you are thinking that you want to make sure, really sure, that people don't think you've been overly ambitious, you might deliberately propose a very narrow, very constrained in scope proposal so that you're almost certainly not going to run the risk of someone saying it's too grand, it's too ambitious. You might get the rejection that it's too narrow, it's not big enough, it's not substantial enough, but again, you're exerting some level of control. And obviously vice versa, you might deliberately want to make sure that there's no chance you'll be rejected for not being ambitious enough by promoting something that's really ambitious in scope. And again, you're exerting some level of control over what will happen even in the case that you are unsuccessful in the proposal. Switching from grants to other types of activities in a research career, academic career, and other related careers, another type of activity that is quite common for many is applying for prizes or promotions. And one of the key decisions here is how confident you come across in terms of how you're portraying your validity or your worthiness for the promotion or the prize, and how sort of sensible and objective your commentary is. Again, this is going to come down to the nature of the scheme and what they've specifically instructed you to do so. But in academia, in a lot of cases, people are not very good at naturally talking about their achievements and claiming appropriate credit. And so one of the things I do a lot of work with a lot of the people I mentor is really working with them to make sure that the people who are reading their promotion application or their prize application, there's no chance that those people reading it are going to be left uncertain about exactly what your claiming is significant or great about what you're submitting. And so erring on the side of perhaps being even a little bit overconfident and perhaps pushing the cool things you've done a little bit harder than you would feel natural doing so. Talking yourself up is a relatively unnatural activity for a lot of people when they first get started, but it is a part of applying for some of these types of promotions or prizes. So again, you're deliberately choosing to err on the side of making sure there's no doubt about the significance of what you're submitting. You might run the risk of someone saying, I think they think it's a bit more significant than it actually is. You're always going to run a risk one way or the other, but at least you're exerting some level of control over which way you're going to be assessed and interpreted, even in the case where you're unsuccessful. The final example I will give is in the context of a research paper. And again, this depends on the context, the venue that you're submitting the paper to, and the quality and significance of the work that you are submitting. I'll give one particular example. Let's say you're at that amazing opportunity where you've had that once in a decade really major breakthrough and you've got some absolutely stunning research to report on. In that sort of situation, depending on the venue and depending on your personal preference, you might decide to deliberately be overly objective and perhaps even slightly underplay the significance of the work because it's so self-evidently amazing, and run the risk or deliberately make sure that no one's going to accuse you of over-claiming or overemphasizing the significance of the research because it speaks for itself, because it's so inherently awesome. Again, this always comes with a risk. You are reducing the risk that someone will think you're overclaiming, but increasing the risk a little bit, hopefully a very low risk, that someone will miss the huge significance of what you're proposing. Of course, in some situations, it might be appropriate to do the opposite, where you're a little bit more aggressive or pushing in terms of the significance of what you're contributing in a paper. And again, this is going to come down to the specifics of the venue, your risk appetite, but the key point here is to think about which way you would like to be rejected in terms of the feedback in order to exert some control over that outcome. There are a couple of caveats, of course, with this sort of approach. The first is, of course, that most of these things don't exist on a simple one-dimensional sort of axis. For example, I posed some of the earlier examples as being on an axis from a very conservative, very incremental grant proposal all the way to a blue sky, grandiose, extremely ambitious proposal. And that's sort of posing it as a simple one-dimensional axis, but of course it's not that simple. There's a number of properties at play here. The reason we think about it in terms of this simple axis is to make it a bit more manageable, so it's a bit easier to think about and a bit easier to craft your strategy. The other caveat here, of course, is that there's always a risk. Basically, you're not reducing the overall risk with your proposals, your applications here. What you are doing is you are controlling which risks are biggest and which risks are a little bit less. If you take this too far to an extreme, so example, you really overemphasize or overclaim the significance of a research contribution or of something you're submitting for a prize application, you do run the risk of burning some bridges, causing a lot of reputational damage, because the people who are reading this are often your peers, and I think they are going to be relatively tolerant of you being very proud and excited about an achievement, but they're not going to tolerate factual inaccuracies. And so you can take this too far if you're not sort of careful about how you implement a policy like this. So this is not a magic trick. It's not a trick that's going to get all your grants or proposals accepted, but it is going to give you a little bit more of a sense of control over the outcomes in your academic career. And in a modern day academic career where so much stuff seems to be so far outside your circles of control, so to speak, this is a really nice way I've found, and many of the people I've worked with have found, to sort of think deliberately about how you want to craft something so that you have at least a little bit more certainty and control about how it's going to be received, whether or not it's successful or not.